I left Honorable Segona in his constituency. Honorable chairs and colleagues, I have shared with you a presentation that I have prepared for the committee. I am not going to read, if so pleases you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to highlight the areas in this statement and try to speak to it and try to break it down as best as I could. So, honorable colleagues, the background to this bill has been well set out by the Honorable Minister of Internal Affairs and is really to deal with the management of our sovereignty. Honorable colleagues and honorable members, this is based out of our Objective 4 of the National Objectives and Directive Principles of State Policy, which require that the state and the citizens shall endeavor to build national strength in political, economic, and social spheres to avoid undue dependence on other countries and institutions. Honorable colleagues, Article 1 of the Constitution reaffirms the sovereignty of the people of Uganda, and the sovereignty of the people of Uganda is to ensure that nothing threatens the nation's ability to self-govern without undue external influence. Colleagues, in the absence of the law to protect the nation's ability to self-govern, there has been increase in the interference in our development and implementation of our government policies. Of course, I must emphasize that under our legal and constitutional framework, the policy of government is determined by the government in power at the time, the ruling government at the time. Every citizen has a right to participate in the formulation of that policy, but they are not the policy holders. They share, and then the policy is determined by the government. So this is done through the representatives that we elect, all the way from LC1 all the way to the top. That is how policy is formulated. Otherwise, you can find a situation where each one of us, 41 million Ugandans, may have an idea on how a particular matter, for example, some of us may think that we should drive on the right-hand side, and others think we should drive on the left-hand side. Imagine a country where every citizen decides to engage in their own policy. That would be chaos. So that is brought together by the government now, coming together and engaging with the citizens and coming up with a common policy on that issue. I'm using a simplified, a simplistic example, but it's just to try and drive home why it's extremely important for someone to be responsible for a policy of government. So, honorable colleagues, like the Honorable Minister of Internal Affairs stated, we have several laws that have looked to try and address this issue. But we do not have any particular legislation which has boldly and openly come out to address the issue of protection of sovereignty. And that is what this law is looking to do. Honorable colleagues, Annexure 1 to my brief has got the list of jurisdictions and pieces of legislation that we have consulted. This is not new to Uganda. We have there 17, but if you go out there, you'll find as many as the countries exist on how they deal with the issue of protection of their sovereignty. The issue is, how do we want to do it, and why should we do it that way? And like the Honorable Minister of Internal Affairs said, we need to make a law which works for Uganda. Honorable colleagues, at page 4, I address the justification of the bill, and the justification of the bill is clearly set out in the objectives of the bill. It is to fill the policy gaps, to cover the areas that are not covered by the law, to preserve national security and social stability, to uphold self-determination in policy making, strengthen governance and accountability, and of course protecting the cultural integrity and social values of the people of Uganda. Honorable colleagues, honorable chairs and colleagues, now I go to page 5 and address the scope of the bill, and I want to spend some time on this area because I think this is where our legal part comes in. Honorable chairpersons and members of the Protection for Sovereignty Bill seeks to enact a law that intends to provide the protection of the sovereignty of the people of Uganda by regulating agents of foreigners and funding from foreigners that is intended to influence government policy. maybe just to emphasize here, everyone will look to influence government policy, and every Ugandan has a right to participate in any process to influence government policy. But if you're influencing government policy in the interest of a foreign player, that is what this law is dealing with. So if you come here to Parliament and you want a policy to be addressed, you want an issue to be looked at, that's perfectly fine. But if you come to Parliament, even as a citizen of Uganda, for purposes of influencing the policy for the benefit of a foreigner, then that's not good. And that's not acceptable. And that's what this bill is looking to protect. In particular, Clause 2 of the bill stipulates the specific areas that the bill will apply to. And I think this is what we need to really address our minds to. Because I have heard people talking about people carrying on their legitimate business being affected by the sovereignty bill, people sending money to their parents or parents and children and etc. being affected by the sovereignty bill. That's not the scope of this bill. And I'll go through these items one by one. The scope of the bill deals with engaging in political activities of Uganda for and in the interest of a foreigner. So if you're dealing with political activities in Uganda for the interest of Ugandan, that cannot be the scope of this bill. But if it's for interest of the foreigner, that's the scope of this bill. Soliciting, collecting, disbursing or dispensing contribution, loans, money or other things of value for or in the interest of a foreigner. Representing the interest of a foreigner before any agency or official of government, of the government of Uganda. For example, you may come here and say, we should not be, I have a foreign entity which I'm representing here, and its view is that the foreigners who are dealing in business in Uganda should not be required to pay tax. That's perfectly fine. But when you come to government, to the government official, come and tell us you're an agent of a foreigner and you represent the interest of a foreigner, so we listen to you as such. That's what the law is saying. The law is saying you cannot, it is not stopping you from representing the interest of a foreigner, because there may be Ugandans who have interests of foreigners here. We are saying just lawfully do it. Register and say, I am an agent of a foreigner and this is my interest. And not to say that every foreign policy is bad. But if you bring it to Uganda, bring it clearly, stating what your interest is in that policy. Agreeing, consenting, or assuming, or purporting to act as, or who is, or holds himself or herself out to promote the interest of a foreigner against the interests of Uganda. We have our cultural values. If you want to go and promote a foreign value, it's perfectly fine. Just register as a foreigner and an agent of a foreigner and represent that interest. Influencing the development policy of Uganda. For example, in Uganda here, we may say that our development policy now is putting money in the hands of the people through PDM. But you may have a different view. And maybe there is a foreigner out there who does not think it is good for government to give direct grants to the people of Uganda. Because when you give grants to the people of Uganda, maybe they want to borrow money from the bank and etc. And therefore it is your interest to come and promote. So that is the policy of government. The policy of government is under PDM. But if you're coming here to influence that policy negatively or otherwise for the interest of the foreigner, then that law prohibits that. Funding political parties, organizations, or other persons contesting for elections. If you're a foreigner, you have an agent of a foreigner, you want to install into government a government. So you decide to form a political party, you get funding from outside for purposes of protecting the interests of foreigners by, for example, saying, after we have come, we shall amend the law and give all these other people from this country citizenship in Uganda. That's wrong. So you become an agent of those people. And that's what the law is saying. The law is saying just register, come and do it, and feel free to act accordingly. So the scope of the Act, as stipulated in Clause 2, is exactly how far it goes. It will not apply to funds received by private person, commercial entities, for family purposes. If I'm receiving money from a foreigner for purposes of doing my business, that has nothing to do with the scope in Clause 2. So that cannot be foreign. That cannot be, you cannot become an agent of a foreigner for that. So it can only be in that scope. So the Act will only apply to funds that are meant to fund the activities listed in Clause 2. That is the activities that are intended to promote the interests of foreigners, influencing the development policy of Uganda, and funding of political activities or contesting for elections for the benefit of foreigners. Of course, the question has been out there. How do we know? That's a question of evidence. For example, when we wrote the law that it shall be criminal to commit murder, we did not tell you how to prove murder. If you stab by the knife, we go and get the evidence, the DNA, in order to prove that you committed that offense. So even if a person received funding from a foreigner and it is meant for these purposes, it is incumbent upon government, if they intend to prosecute that person under this law, to get the evidence to confirm that that person actually brought those funds for that purpose. And if they cannot, then the law will not be held against that person. Honorable Chair and members, concerns have been raised regarding some of the definitions in the bill. It is important to note that the definitions provided for under the bill are only limited to the context of the bill. The word foreigner, for instance, in the bill is used in reference to a foreigner who engages in activities as set out in Clause 2 of the bill. That is activities that are intended to promote the interests of foreigners. So further, the inclusion of Ugandan citizens residing outside Uganda in the definition of a foreigner is only limited to instances of where a Ugandan citizen residing outside Uganda is engaged in activities under Clause 2 of the bill, and that does not affect their citizenship. Honorable colleagues, maybe just to emphasize this, because it has been a matter of grave concern in the public domain. Of course, the committee will look at it, and we will all look at it, and if there is clarity that needs to be made, we make the clarification. We are saying, for example, if a Ugandan citizen has $100,000 and is in America or in Sweden or in another country outside Uganda, and he decides to spend that money to support his local MP in an election, that's not an action of a foreigner. That's him acting for himself. But if that Ugandan had $100,000 and in concert with foreigners said, let us install a particular MPX for purposes of doing this activity, that person becomes an agent of a foreigner. So even you in Uganda here, if you're in Uganda here and you get money to support an MP, but you get that money for purposes of supporting the interests of a foreigner, you become an agent of a foreigner. So this has nothing to do with citizenship. It has everything to do with the action that you're doing, the purpose for which you're doing that action. And I'm sure the committee will look at it, and if need be, we can correct, clarify, amend, whatever it is, so long as the purpose is not lost. The purpose is, it is not to take away the citizenship of that person, but it is to tell all of us, do not act for the interest of a foreigner. But every Ugandan should be at liberty to participate in the affairs of this country as long as they are acting for their own interest as Ugandans.
Mr. Chairman, with your permission, maybe just in case I lose sight of this, what does the Attorney General and the government lose in simply criminalizing activity without dubbing a Ugandan a foreigner? What do you lose? Because the Baganda sense bambi edibyamutele. What do you lose by simply criminalizing activity without referring to a Ugandan as a foreigner? You know, sometimes you cause resentment which is not necessary.
Okay, that's a political way of looking at it. The legal way of looking at it is that the person needs to know that what they are doing is criminal.
Would it be less criminal if you did not use the word foreigner?
No, it will not be less criminal. But for me, my view is, why do I go around in circles? If I want to talk about you, why don't I talk about you? Why should I?
You can actually talk about me without profiling me as a foreigner.
I think that's what the committee...
Actually, what you're talking about
I think that's what the committee can do.
Not legal.
That's what the committee can do. That's what I've suggested. If you think that our view of doing things, then you can correct it. But for us, what we are doing...
That is if I think your view of doing things is political.
If you think, whatever view you may hold, Honorable Segona, I think that is